Welcome, deer hunters, managers, and enthusiasts. This is Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. My name is Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. Bronson and I are professors of wildlife management and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. Together, we've researched deer across the United States for more than 40 years. In our podcasts, we explain the why and how of deer management based on science, whether it's research we've conducted or explaining research done elsewhere. We'll offer you a college course in the science of deer management.
But don't let Steve scare you. This isn't going to be a review of calculus or chemistry. Instead, we take results of research, reduce it to what's important, and explain how you can apply research to management. So join us for this episode of Deer University. Welcome back to the Deer University podcast. I'm joined today by deer guru Steve Damaris. And Steve, we wanted to give more or less an update on this episode about CWD. And it's probably going to be one of many to come in terms of updating the listeners about the CWD saga that's taking place in Mississippi and in a lot of states across the nation. We are state number 25 as a reminder to the episode we recorded back in February, right after the first case was documented. So, Steve, this most recent case, it was about, I'm rounding here, about 2 weeks ago from when we were recording now. What does this mean, the second case, which was not in the same location as the first case?
No, in fact, Bronson, it was about 170 miles as the crow flies from the first case. And so, that distance suggests that this animal is not from the same source of the disease as the first animal. And the idea with that first animal, it was tested, a lot of animals were tested around the first animal and there were no positives, but it was, under flooded conditions, and so deer were, in different places than they normally reside, so it was hard to, the actual area where that animal, died was totally underwater when the animals were collected. So the agency did a great job of collecting animals, but they didn't know exactly where the animals originated that they collected. They're just down in that general area, up on high ground because of the floodwaters. So we haven't really fully evaluated that southern delta region yet. But we do know that, there was just that one animal down in that area, and probably that animal dispersed into that area from somewhere else. That would be the best guess, because, enough animals were tested, whether they were moved from the flood or not. I mean, clearly there's not a concentration down there of the disease. And so where did it come from? That animal had to have gotten it from somewhere and probably dispersed to that area. So we don't know where that epicenter is, where that disease focal area might be. That's yet to come. We may never find it, but likely we will find another area where that animal came from, because our analysis of the genetic samples was that it was an animal that was born in that general South Delta area.
Eliminating the possibility that that deer was not foreign to Mississippi.
That's right.
That deer was not brought in from another state infected.
Yes.
Yeah, it was a native deer.
And so now we have this 170 miles or more away, another individual deer. So that would suggest that that animal didn't disperse, they probably didn't disperse from the same source of the disease.
Right.
So we probably have two clusters of the disease in the state somewhere. And still, we just have these two individual deer, so we don't know where they got it from. The Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks is doing a great job organizing to collect a lot of samples from all the counties throughout the Mississippi, and after this hunting season, we should have a much better sense of or understanding of where the disease is distributed throughout the state.
And that's something, Steve, I've been urging hunters in Mississippi to do, is to submit as many samples as possible. Of course, there's some reasons to submit those samples we can talk about a little bit later, regarding, the hunter consuming the meat and getting it tested. But the other part of that is let's help out MDWF&P, and let's help out scientifically our understanding of where these focal points are, where these potentially epicenters are at. And the most efficient way we can do that as hunters this fall is to submit as many samples as possible.
That's right. And there's certain kinds of animals that should be submitted, and we need to get back to that in a minute.
Right.
But while you know how I get wandering
right
on these tangents. Back to your original question, what does this new animal mean? We've got this distance, and that suggests that there's maybe 2 source populations that have the disease in the state. The other thing that's important is this was a 1.5-year-old buck, and he had clinical symptoms, meaning the disease was fully expressing itself in him. So he had it for a while, and he probably caught it as a very young animal, probably as a fawn. And that means he probably caught it from his family group of his mother and maybe the previous year's yearling doe, that little family unit that tends to be a mature doe, her recent female offspring, and immediate fawns.
Yeah.
And so that little family unit probably has it. Question is, where is that family unit? That's why we need.
And are there more family units just like it?
That's right.
In that area.
So those are the 2 things that this has helped us learn, that there's probably 2 areas, and that there's some females that have it somewhere. And we just need to get back to the hunters submitting samples. So what kind of samples should hunters submit? Any deer that's killed?
Well, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. I'm sure there's probably more preferred specimens, but I'm going to submit every single deer I harvest this fall and winter. Absolutely.
Because you want to know, did you harvest a positive animal?
I want to know, did I harvest a positive animal? And we can get into that a little bit later for the reasons why I want to know. But also for the very reason we're talking about is adult females, young females, adult bucks, etc. I want to have as many samples as possible, as many dots on the map to show where a sample had taken place from.
That's right. Data.
More data.
Data is important,
yeah.
and that helps us understand what we would call the episodiology of the disease. Is where is it, and how is it potentially spreading?
Let me ask you another term, since you just threw out that fancy word there.
Yeah.
Since I've been digging a lot deeper into this the past 6 months or so, there's a lot of different words used, like symptomatic and clinical. And I think you mentioned that a moment ago, that this deer was symptomatic and or clinical. And that just really means they are expressing the symptoms that we most commonly associate with chronic wasting disease.
That's right.
A deer can have the disease and not be, quote, clinical, meaning showing these external signs. But when a biologist says that deer was clinical, it means they looked like, is this correct?
Yes, absolutely.
They looked like a deer suffering from chronic wasting disease.
Yeah, and that gets back to my earlier comment that we should talk about what kind of animals are best to get tested. Yes, any deer I kill, whether it's a buck, a doe, young or old, I'm going to get it tested too, for the reasons that we'll talk about in a little bit. But from the standpoint of the probability of finding a positive animal, males tend to have it more frequently than females, and so males are a target animal, and it tends to express more obviously in older animals.
Yeah, the longer you live, the greater likelihood likelihood you have of catching it.
Yes, and it builds up over time in an animal. So an animal could have it early in its, early in its development within an animal and be tested, and it doesn't show positive because it just hasn't had a chance to get to the areas that are tested.
Right.
So an animal could be positive and not show that it actually has the disease. So the agency would love to have, or most prefer to have, animals that are older males. And so if you harvest an older male, definitely get it tested. And then target those target animals, that older males, and then animals hit on the road. And that's because one of the symptoms of the disease is a loss of perception of your environment, what's around you, and a loss of motor skills. And so animals crossing the road that have the disease, they tend not to be as aware of vehicles, and so they're going to be less apt to get out of the way and be more likely to be hit. And so those are another target of the preferred target animals. And then lastly are ones that are expressing clinical symptoms, that are lost their fear of humans, they're salivating excessively, they're doing stuff that are
thin, emaciated.
Yeah. They're not behaving like normal deer. So those are the kind of target animals. But as a hunter, you and I are going to have any animal that we kill tested.
Yeah, absolutely. Didn't we learn at that, there was the symposia at the conference we went to in August, the International Deer Biology Congress. Wasn't it discussed a few times on the probability of harvest is greater for deer that have CWD?
Yeah.
Because of the very reason you spoke about with the car collisions.
Yeah, they lose their ability to sense the environment and sense potential predator.
Which we are.
That's right. And that might help you actually increase your success rate when you actually go hunting.
That really stinks to think about it, that I would have to resort to a disease to increase my odds of harvesting an adult buck. But
you don't need that.
Yeah.
You don't need that kind of crutch.
I wanted to emphasize this point too. This would be just for people in Mississippi, that finding these locations. I know when we talked to MDWF&P after this news broke, that they were going to be adding different drop-off locations because of this. Most recent finding in Pontotoc County. And so if someone is wondering where they can drop a sample off, is just go to MDWF&P's website.
Yeah, mdwfp.com.
And then there's a link, I believe, an obvious link for CWD information. I think when you click on that, it'll show a map and description and all sorts of information like that. Okay, so here's another big one. That's about sampling. We encourage all hunters, every deer they harvest, to submit the sample. And the information you provided, are there better samples than others? Yeah, there are. So we would really encourage people to provide those samples to help out the scientific community, to help the State Wildlife Agency, help us all understand the extent and spread of this disease and where it's at. Now we get to the question of consumption of the meat.
Yeah, that's a tough one. And I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about this. And before we get into exactly what we've learned and how we feel, because like we say in our introduction, we're hunters. We are actively engaged in the sport and the recreation, and we feel about we feel the passion, just like everybody that's probably listening to our podcast they're passionate about deer hunting. So we have that same feeling. We've spent a lot of time researching deer, and we understand how research is done and the implications and the limitations of research. And we've spent a lot of time just trying to learn specifically about this because of our role as educators. So we spend a lot of time worrying about it and thinking about it and talking about it. But let's talk about the big picture. The disease has been present in the United States for known for over 50 years. There are states that have had it for dozens of years, decades, and people have been eating potentially infected venison, and we are such we being the state of Mississippi, we've got 2 animals, and so we are just at the cusp of worrying about this in more specific detail. So as a hunter, you harvest a deer, and you're going to take this meat home and you're going to eat it, but more importantly, your family's going to eat it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have kids, your kids are going to eat it. Well, it's reasonable to worry about it.
Yeah, and when I think of, if I'm just pulling the numbers out of my hat here, probably greater than 80% of the red meat consumed in my household is venison. Mm-hmm. Of course, wild fish goes along with that, but of the red meat, I don't know if I've bought a beef steak, roast. I honestly can't remember. And I do the grocery shopping.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I can't remember. So I've really been thinking about this, Steve, from my perspective and probably a more testosterone-centric brain of a little more macho, I'm willing to take a risk, et cetera, et cetera. And then you've got your family and you've got kids. And do I want to expose them to risk? Mm-hmm. And so that has been the dialogue in my head and in a lot of people's heads. And I guess, Steve, something we've talked about, and I'm obviously no expert on this. And that's why, I have a lot of caution when I talk about CWD because it's so stinking complicated. This isn't something easy to get your arms wrapped around. It is really, really sophisticated, really complicated, a lot of layers of detail here. But it does seem like we've got 2 ends of the continuum, and I probably fall somewhere in between. If you look at all the things that have been reproduced in a laboratory and add them up as possible, what all is possible to happen, it can become overwhelming of how negative that is, of what of all is possible.
And on that same extreme end, or that level of worry would be during flu season, if you're so worried about catching the flu, you don't go outside. You stay at your house, you don't go to work, you don't go to church, you don't go to the grocery store.
You don't answer the front door.
Yeah, that's right. You just stay in your house and have special filters and, take lots of vitamin C and, there's an extreme end of concern. Right. So I'm sorry I interrupted, but you're going to go to the other extreme.
And then the other would be, it's going to happen. Some people, I can get killed in a car wreck on the way home from work today. There's acceptable risk, and then we look at this, Steve, what you started with a moment ago. This disease has been around for 50 years. That we know of, that's been documented. So it could have occurred before that, before scientists really figured out what was going on. And there's yet to be a clearly definable, documented cause and effect of CWD, those prions from a deer, from a cervid, infecting a human being. Mm-hmm. That has yet to be documented. Even though, when we look at the bovine, the cow version of this with mad cow disease, there were some cases in the UK, numerous cases where that happened. And so I think that's probably why we as human beings, we see a cow, the bovine version of CWD, deer, CWD, humans got it from consuming some of those infected cows, and we think, we should be concerned.
Yes.
And that does cause concern for a lot of people. But it has never been documented.
That's right. And the sheep version is a sheep variant of this disease, this prion disease. Scrapie, yeah. And it was initially documented in sheep, not as that particular disease, but sheep with the symptoms was documented back in the 1700s. And so for hundreds of years, scrapie has been present in sheep, and people have been eating sheep and never got scrapie. So the 50-year thing with deer, and then there's the couple 100-year with scrapie, and lots of people eat sheep and work with sheep, and that's never been transferred. So we've got examples where the dang thing probably doesn't transfer to humans from sheep. We thought it didn't from cows, but it did. And then we've got this deer variation. And then even within deer, we've shown, not we, but science has shown that there's different variants of deer genetics, that some deer are more susceptible and some deer are less susceptible to the progression of the disease. And so there's a lot of variation in individuals and their genetic makeup that ties back. What we're talking about here is a prion or a prion that's a protein that's associated with the neurologic material in the central nervous system, in the brain, in nerves, basically.
Every vertebrate has a prion.
That's right. But then there's normal prions, and then there's these misfolded ones. But then there's variations of the misfolded prion or prion, and then there's variations of the individual species that's susceptible to the variations of the misfolded prions. And so you have all this
layers upon layers upon layers.
Yes, of variation.
Yeah.
And so it's very difficult to say anything with 100% surety that it never will or that it will, because there's so much variation. And there's this disease, these prion diseases are prevalent or present in other species besides cows, sheep, and deer. There's a mink version of it, and it's been shown that within each species there's variations of the prions within that species, and variations probably at the individual animal level for the susceptibility. And so there's just a lot of moving parts and layers of uncertainty.
Well, and humans as well. There's a human form of this, Creutzfeldt-Jakob.
Yes. And again, there's variations of susceptibility to that's genetically linked.
Right.
And then there's a vole, a species of vole, a small mammal, that is susceptible to all kinds of prion diseases.
Man, unfortunately for them, huh?
Yeah. Of course, they probably don't go around eating a lot of sheep or cow or venison or mink.
They're a pretty short-lived animal anyway, so they wouldn't live with it very long.
But that's an example of a species that's highly susceptible to all variation. So there's just a lot of variation, and it's difficult to say with certainty that you're going to be able, that humans will get chronic wasting disease or the human variant of the disease from eating venison that's infected. But we also can't say that with absolute surety that they won't.
And that's why an organization like the CDC, for example, they're certainly not going to come out and say it is absolutely, positively, zero probability, no chance whatsoever. Because of this variation you're talking about, is there could be some very, very rare case of where it could happen.
Yes, in fact, the variants that exist within the prions, those variants exist due to replication of proteins, and whenever DNA replicates, there's always the potential for a mutation. And those variants of the prions are due to those mutations. And so to say that there's no way that something could happen, even if you said it right now based on what we know, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be an additional mutation that might be more susceptible to another species. So we're rambling a lot about this whole variation thing, but bottom line is there's a huge amount of moving parts, and we cannot say with surety, those two extremes that we're talking about, the sky is falling or heck, it's not going to happen.
Yep.
Those ends of the spectrum are both probably wrong.
Yeah.
And I think we fall somewhere in the middle, based on our previous conversations. I mean, we're passionate about deer. We want to eat venison. And knowing what you know, what's your thought process? What do you think about when you're making a decision about? You said you're going to test every animal that you harvest. Run us through the thought process that led you to that.
The rationale for me, and so this is not based on, this is not a recommendation for anybody else whatsoever. This is just the information that I've processed, trying to weigh the sky is falling version against the it's impossible for me to get some prion-based neurological disorder because of this. I mean, I'm going to take, I guess at this point, this deer season, it may change next deer season. Steve, after we find out, after deer are collected this fall, we may have a very clear pattern of where this disease is at in the state. Mm-hmm. And so there may be places I go and hunt in the state where I may not want to sample it in the future. I may feel like there's no need to. Mm-hmm. But for this deer season, I want to be, number one, I want to help MDWF&P. I want to collect the data. Number two for me is it is so easy right now. The state agency has made it so easy for the animal to be tested. I'm going to test it. Simple as that. There are collection places all over the state. I think in 10 days, give or take, I'm going to be able to know whether that deer tested positive or negative, and totally to have a clear conscience with my kids. If it tested positive, I'm not going to take a chance with them. Mm-hmm. Now, maybe, Steve, if I were a bachelor, I don't know. Let me tell you a little story, and I'm not going to name any names, but some people I trust. There are some guys I know who are biologists and are very up on this information with CWD. They lived in areas like you spoke about previously that have been dealing with this for a decade or longer. They are readily aware of people that no longer test their deer. Mm-hmm. They are in areas, Steve, where the prevalence rate, at least for bucks, is greater than 20%. So if they're killing 2, 3, 4 deer a year, probability 1 out of those 4 a year has CWD. Mm-hmm. And they've been doing that for over a decade. And there has not been any evidence in those human beings, in those human populations, in those areas of where there's this increased rate of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Mm-hmm. So that lends support to maybe this species barrier is in fact a barrier. But maybe it's not.
Yeah.
It's not an issue, Steve, until it's an issue.
That's right.
And when it's an issue, it's a fatal issue.
Yes.
That's what it's not a big deal until you get a fatal disease.
Yeah.
And then the game's over. There's no going back and modifying and doing it different. You're done.
You've got it.
You got it.
Yeah.
You're not getting rid of it.
Some amount of time, you're going to be dead.
Yeah.
From that disease.
Yep. And so someone, of course, if you think more about that, then that would tend to make you more cautious. Mm-hmm. So, again, back to the two ends of the spectrum there, we've got a lot of, I hate to say anecdotal, I think it's beyond anecdotal, but there's a lot of, when you look across the range of where CWD has been for a number of years and in decades, some of those people, intentionally or not, they are consuming CWD infected deer.
Yes.
And we are not at any increased rate. We're not seeing an increased rate of Creutzfeldt-Jakob.
Yes, and I might qualify what you're saying there, because symptoms of Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease is similar or not dissimilar to Parkinson's disease and dementia, Alzheimer's, and so the other side of that argument, or that a different perspective on that statement, is that most older people that get those kinds of diseases, they're diagnosed and based on symptoms, and the people die, and they don't test them for prion-associated diseases. So that's a little bit different perspective on that. Now,
and what would the test be? The test for that would be, given enough time, that let's just pick on Alzheimer's, then the rate of Alzheimer's in that area, let's call it a CWD hot zone, would be elevated.
Yes.
And I can't point my finger at a study, but at least the word amongst people I trust, biologists that have looked into this, they can't point their finger to any large-scale study saying, man, Alzheimer's is 4 times greater in this region where people hunt a bunch and eat.
Yeah. But also, just to be argumentative, because, I think we have generally the same perspective, but we tend to maybe emphasize things a little differently. I don't know that there's been a study of those specific disease diagnoses in people that eat a lot of venison, that are hunters and eat a lot of venison, compared to people that don't eat venison. Maybe that study has been done, but I wonder if it has been. And it'd be great if some people started looking at those things.
Yeah. Oh, that's completely fair. I think and this is what science is about, right? We're supposed to attack this from every angle, pros, cons, what are the deficiencies of this study, so I think that perspective and viewpoint is completely accurate.
Yeah. It needs to be researched more.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that aspect has been evaluated fully, not to my knowledge. One of the things I like about you're really great at analogies and word pictures, and you study how to do that, and you apply it, and so you're really good with these word pictures. And so
I'm waiting for the but. I'm waiting for.
No, there is no but. I like some of the analogies you've used to refer to this probability. There's no question there. Just talk about some of your cool analogies to help people think about this.
Well, I wish I knew the probability. That's the big unknown, right? That's the deer management Nobel Prize, is what is the probability of a human contracting some type of prion-related disease from eating infected venison, CWD infected venison. We don't know what the probability is. Based on what I have read, I'm leaning more towards winning the lottery. So, can I, if I play the mega bucks, mega billion, whatever, can I win that lottery? I absolutely can. Sure enough, I can. What's the likelihood of me winning the lottery? Very, very low. Really astronomically low. I have no idea if that disparate probability is representative of the situation with CWD in humans. Maybe it's more like lightning strike, like we've talked about. It's very, very unlikely that I'm going to get struck by lightning. But I can increase the odds of me being struck by lightning. They still may be low, but if a thunderstorm's going on outside and I'm seeing lightning pop around the sky, and I stand out there in the wide open and wave a golf club or some type of metal object like that, it still may be that my odds are 1% of getting struck, but I've increased the odds from where they were had I been in a protected area, not out in the open.
That's right. And if you get struck, it's kind of like that fatal disease.
Yeah.
So if it's something potentially really serious, you want to use reason to minimize the probability of something really bad happening.
Right. That's just kind of the way I'm looking at this, my perspective.
Yeah. We're not going to run around with a golf club in the air during a thunderstorm.
No.
But that doesn't mean we're not ever going to, we're going to go into the cellar and get into a rubberized room because of the thunderstorm.
Yeah. I'm not going to lock myself away for the next 20 years worrying about being struck by lightning. So those are the kind of things, Steve, we've been talking about, working through, you and I here recently, is best case scenario, worst case scenario. I really do. I hope that come February, March of 2019, we're going to have so many samples, hunter-collected samples throughout the state, that we're going to have a really, really good picture of where the disease is at, what the prevalence rate would be, and then we're going to have a more clear plan going forward.
We wrestle, folks, we wrestle with what we should say and can say, and we decided we just need to say some things, and that's why we're having this conversation, that just sharing the things that we wrestled with. So this has really been an emotional experience for us as passionate deer hunters. We've researched the material that is available in the literature and the science. We can't say that there's absolutely no impossible danger, but we're not going to say that the sky is falling either. But we share a lot of the thoughts that every hunter shares and concerns. And I'm going to continue to hunt. I'm going to eat my venison. But before I do that, I'm going to get it tested.
And, this is another example, Steve, of this is a big, in terms of a science question, this is a big question. And there are a lot of details, there are a lot of layers, and on different analyses we've done in the past, either with our science we're conducting or when we're reviewing other big questions in the deer biology world, there's a foundation. We say it's an iterative process. We add another brick of knowledge, and then another little question, another brick of knowledge, and another. And over time, you start piecing together the puzzle of this really, really complex problem. And so I think that's where we're at now. We still don't have a lot of these definitive answers, like the most obvious one being, can a human get it from eating infected meat? We can't say that it's impossible. Maybe this time next year we might be able to. Probably not, because as you mentioned, there's probably going to be some very, very, very low probability of a particular human being, because of some genetic variation, etc., may be susceptible to it. But I guess that's what I would say, Steve, right now is, we're going to use caution. We're still learning about this, but we're state number 25. So before us, 24 other states were asking these same questions, going through this same process. And so we're part of that gang now, and we hope in this podcast, throughout this deer season, we'll provide updates as we can. Whenever we learn new knowledge, we'll make sure our listeners know about it. So that's where we're at now.
In the meantime, we're going to enjoy the hunting season.
You better believe it.
Harvest some deer.
Absolutely.
Eat some venison.
I'm going to eat some venison. I'm trying to think. I cooked venison this weekend. I'm trying to think if we're going to have leftovers tonight or not. But probably before this week is over, I will be eating venison again. No doubt about it. Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you for your time. And like I said earlier, as soon as we get another update, we'll be sure to spread the word.
Good deal. Good hunting.
We're glad you joined us today and hope you learned something valuable about deer management. If you have questions about this podcast or a question about a topic we haven't discussed, please log on to msudeerlab.com, click on the Deer University tab, and send us your questions. We'll get to them as soon as possible. In closing, we want to thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. We also want to thank the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowments that support deer research and education.